Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again for joining us on this latest edition of the ASMIA webinars. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of ASMIA, and this afternoon we have the privilege and honor of hosting my friend, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who is has been a longtime colleague and friend. Schanzer is the Vice President of Research at FDD. He oversees the organization's experts and scholars and leadership of the team of the FDD Economic and Financial Power. He is a prolific writer and scholar, and also a policymaker who's been involved in Washington issues as well as American foreign policy when it comes to the Palestinians. His forthcoming book is about to come out now, related to the recent events that happened in Gaza in May. But over the years, Schanzer has been focused a lot on terror finance and has been involved in the ongoing conversation when it comes to American foreign policy in regard to Islamism, and has also been involved in the debate about the academy, about how we deal with these ongoing topics all along. So this afternoon, John will be talking about these topics relative to our wheelhouse here at ASMIA, how it affected the academy and the discourse on radical Islam at large, and what Washington is seeing today, 20 years after 9/11. The format will be as such. John will talk for about 25 minutes or so, then we'll open up the floor to as many questions as we have. If we don't get to your questions this afternoon, we apologize. You can always email us after. We'll do our best to get to them. But without further ado, John, really, it's a pleasure to have you, and the virtual floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Asaf, for the virtual floor. And I do want to thank Asaf and Suzanne and ASMIA for hosting me today. It's really remarkable, actually. I've known Suzanne since I was 12, and Asaf since I was a young, dark-haired graduate student at Hebrew University. So these are longtime friends, and I very much appreciate the work of ASMIA. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to revisit the academic analysis of the Middle East and what has traditionally been called the war on terror. It's been many years since I have taken some time out to examine the field. At one point, this was part of my job as I was working for the Middle East Forum, which is a think tank in Philadelphia. Back in the early 2000s, the Middle East Forum created a project called Campus Watch, and it was under the direction of Daniel Pipes, the director of the Middle East Forum, and Winfield Myers, who currently still runs this program. And they, they did a lot of work examining the various professors and the sort of silly things that were the focus of academics over the last 20 years. And I have to say, things have not changed very much. I think many, if not most, of the critiques that have been posted on Campus Watch are valid, and many of those I think still hold. And also, I think it's fair to say that if these critiques had been taken to heart, the field probably would have improved significantly, although I don't see that happening right now. As I prepared for today's discussion, I was reminded of a consequential event in my own life. It took place in January, maybe February of 2001. I had just returned from graduate studies. I got a master's degree at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I had spent 2.5 years studying Hebrew and Arabic, but also the history of the Middle East. And ultimately, I decided to focus on radical Islamic movements or Islamist movements. And it was how I devoted my studies. I spent hours at night reading up on additional material. I really felt like I had found my life's work. And I came back and I applied to a number of top PhD programs in the United States. And when I got some of my letters of acceptance, I went and took a tour of a couple of schools. I won't name the schools themselves, but suffice it to say, there was one that I went to visit, and I sat with the modernist, the one professor who, without a doubt, I would have to work with and would probably be my thesis advisor, my dissertation advisor. And we spoke about my passion. We spoke about my studies in about these Islamist movements. And this professor kind of sized me up and was quiet after I explained to him what I wanted to work on. And he said in response, I'm not sure that this is a topic that is suitable for the academy. At which point I said, I can recall that probably in the 1950s, there was a lot of talk about the rise of communism, and there were Soviet studies departments that sprouted up across universities, and look how helpful they were in assisting the US government in its efforts to fight the Cold War. At which point this professor told me, well, I think this is more sensationalist in nature, and that it's how newspapers sell advertising, and this is what, back then it wasn't clickbait, but I think that was really the gist of what he was trying to convey. At which point I said, look, I think there's a real opportunity to get in on the ground floor of this area of study. And that was the moment where the professor got up and literally put a hand on my back and began to push me towards the door. And I left, and I left with a rather bitter taste in my mouth. I resigned myself to continuing my work in think tanks. But then I heard about this remarkable new book published by Martin Kramer, and I see Martin is one of the attendees on today's virtual session. Martin is a Princeton and Columbia educated Middle East specialist who went on to teach at University of Chicago, and Cornell, and Georgetown, and others. And he wrote a book through the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and it's called Ivory Towers on Sand. I'll hold it up here. I think it might come in backwards for you guys to see, but I will just say, for those of you who've not read it, I highly recommend it, even 20 years after it was published. And in fact, Martin actually just tweeted something about this to me the other day. In short, Martin's book explained how the academy had become utterly irrelevant in the field of Middle Eastern studies. To kind of summarize, it explained how the field had been clouded by the, quote, anti-colonialist analysis of Edward Said. It failed to understand or perhaps come to grips with the various strains of Islam that were fomenting violence across the region. It failed to grasp the dynamics or in back then, the lack thereof within the Arab states. I think, fast forward, there were very few academics that really, I think, could have predicted the Arab Spring. By the way, I don't know if many people could have, but certainly there was a failure there. And then finally, there was a fixation that Martin noted with the Palestinian cause. But I think the most scathing critique was that the academy had become utterly irrelevant in Washington. And this last point is crucial because whereas academics were once crucial components of the Beltway ecosystem, it was clear that they were no longer. Their advice and their counsel was sought out less and less as they focused on the wrong things or perhaps even the irrelevant things. And think tankers, like myself, filled the gaping hole that they left with a few exceptions. This is what ultimately convinced me to stay in the think tank space. I did go on to get a PhD at King's College London, actually, which is where Asaf went to get his. We studied under a terrific Middle Eastern studies scholar by the name of Ephraim Karsh. But by the time I was done, it became clear to me that I didn't want to get pulled into the academic world that I had started to critique. And so I've stayed in the think tank space, and in the 2 decades since, a lot has changed for me. My hair color, for one. But the focus of my research has changed too, a number of times. Certainly the politics of Washington look nothing like they did when I first arrived in this town, and we can certainly point to Trump and the pandemic and everything else for those changes. But it's also interesting because now the war on terror, after 20 years, appears to be waning. The withdrawal from Afghanistan is clearly a sign of that, but there is also a pivot to Asia that is underway. And I think this is a really interesting moment because I will be personally curious to see how China studies specialists contribute to the debate here in Washington. This is because the Academy's work in the war on terrorism and the Middle East did not hold up well. And I'll provide some examples, but I think, again, just to stress here, this is an interesting test case. When we look at the failure of Middle Eastern studies and then look at the rise of the China scholars, if they have a more consequential input on the way that policy is constructed, I think it will really be a damning critique on the Middle Eastern studies field. Right? We really haven't seen an opportunity to see how other fields in academia will step into the limelight as America's focus shifts in terms of policy. So, Martin, I'm hoping to see some sort of a comparison from you, perhaps in the coming months or years. But at any rate, so I went back upon this invitation from Asaf and from Asmia to take a look at some of the work that's been produced by scholars in the field of Middle Eastern studies and academia. And some of the work I surveyed attempted to cast America's counterterrorism operations in the Middle East as one driven by racism. That, of course, is a common theme right now. Racism is it's being addressed in the media, it's being addressed everywhere. But I noted that even back in 2017, there was an academic from the UK who penned an article stating that UK counterterrorism strategies are, quote, not about security, it's about racism. And the piece went to some length describing how the national security narrative continues to, quote, normalize and perpetuate anti-Muslim sentiment. I looked at a dissertation from UCLA in 2011 that examined, quote, race, gender, and empire after 9/11. I need to quote this because you can't make this stuff up. The research draws on, quote, the experiences of 60 young adult Muslims in Los Angeles. I'm not sure exactly why that's relevant, along with extensive archival data on Muslim discrimination to provide a comprehensive overview of the radicalized and racialized and gendered processes shaping the representation, oppression, and emergent identities of the Muslim diaspora. Now, another common theme that we see today emerge in kind of the woke culture, if we're to call it that, as I track it in Washington, is a question of gender. This, of course, is also a popular theme. I noted that in 2007, there were a pair of Canadian scholars who wrote a book called Engendering. You can imagine how that's spelled, The War on Terror. This explores how, quote, diverse international actors are using the war on terror as an opportunity to reinforce existing gendered, raced, classed, and sexualized inter/national relations. I got a chuckle from a 2019 thesis at Ohio University that examined the war on terror as a means to perpetuate, quote, the patriarchy through securitization and discipline of female bodies. So again, we get a sense of how the academic realm really was not contributing to ways in which America could win various battles in the war on terror, but instead, I think, devolved into some rather irrelevant discussions. It's not to say that all of them are failures, but I did see that it seemed like it was not relevant for what Washington was struggling with. And to be sure, Washington, as we look back on the failed war on terror, or many of the failures of the war on terror, I should say, there could have been some more help that would have been accepted, I think, by the Pentagon, the State Department, and others. I just didn't see a whole lot there that would have contributed. Another key theme to emerge as I submerged myself in the academic themes of the war on terror was Islamophobia. I recall a rather vapid book that I reviewed for the Wall Street Journal some years ago. I've also got that book here. It was by a journalist by the name of Nathan Lean on the topic, and it was endorsed by, there was a foreword written by Georgetown professor John Esposito, who essentially vilified those who addressed the threat of militant Islamists. So in this case, it wasn't even that academics were being distracted by somewhat more irrelevant topics. In the case of Esposito and others, what we really saw instead was an effort to vilify those who were looking at the movements that the United States government had identified as threats. So really a counterproductive trend in the space of Middle Eastern studies and academia. But there were far more than that. We have Wayne State professor Khalid Beydoun, who wrote a book on this topic titled American Islamophobia, which vilified the United States government writ large for its response to 9/11. You've got Fordham University Associate Professor of Modern Islam, Sarah El-Tantawi, in a webinar just month blaming the critique of terrorist groups like Hamas on the, quote, nexus of anti-Palestinian campaigns and Islamophobia. Now, of course, not every academic wrote this kind of gobbledygook. One academic in particular did, from my perspective, work very hard to influence American policy in Iraq. Here I'm referring to Noah Feldman of Harvard University. I think before that was NYU. He was heavily involved in governance issues relating to Iraq. And in 2008, this is again a book that I reviewed, he wrote a book called The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State. This was, of course, years before the rise of the terrorist group that goes by the same name. I think it was perhaps an unfortunate title, but I think that the substance was also unfortunate as well. Feldman was advocating for a country in the Middle East that was ruled by Sharia law. And for reasons that eluded me, he gave short shrift of focusing on concepts like tolerance and pluralism and egalitarianism. And I would say that this is also a common theme in academia over the last 20 years. We saw a lot of accusations against the West for ignoring these core principles at home. These are, of course, principles that are stressed in kind of social milieu. But academics gave other countries, in particular in the Middle East, a free pass for failing their own people in this regard. Now, in addition to some of these themes, I should just note that, of course, the Palestinian cause remained a core focus of the Academy. This is reinforced by a pervasive culture on campus that has been increasingly anti-Israel, and of late, it's really verged on anti-Semitic. And the recent Gaza war only reinforced this. As Asaf noted, I just recently penned a book that will be coming out through FDD Press next month on this. I don't get into the academia-related debates here, but one does get a sense that the media, our general culture was a pile-on. And this, I think, has just been reinforced by academia over the last several decades. I noted that recently the UNC Chapel Hill campus featured a graduate student teacher by the name of Kylie Broderick, who's teaching about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but is also an open promoter of the BDS movement. Some of those public comments attributed to Broderick include tweeting something about Zionist dirtbags, calling on everyone at UNC to boycott Israeli products. Not exactly the kind of balanced approach that one would hope to hear from a college teacher. There's a story that made some headlines, or at least a dust-up, out of Brown University, and that emerged this year, revealing that a professor by the name of Bashara Domani, who is a rather vitriolic BDS activist, is now set to retain a tenured chair while assuming the presidency of Birzeit University. And you could just imagine that that's a bit of a strange arrangement, to put it mildly. And then, of course, there's former University of Chicago, current Columbia Middle Eastern Studies professor Rashid Khalidi, who's still at it, hammering Israel, promoting Palestinian nationalism. One of his books, Brokers of Deceit from 2014, blamed America for the failure of the peace process. This, of course, is rather rich, given the rejectionism that is still pervasive in Palestinian political culture. I know I need to wrap up in a few minutes, but I also just want to note that in terms of funding, I do want to note that there was one trend that I tracked over the last 20 years or so. And that was a trend that was coming out of the country of Qatar. This is a tiny Persian Gulf nation that created Education City in the late 1990s. I think it was founded in 1997 or 1998. But it's really taken off over the last 20 years. And I think it really has influenced the field. The educational enclave, and I visited the Education City back in 2013. It's a gleaming modern campus, and it includes branches of Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, Carnegie Mellon out of Pennsylvania, Texas A&M, Georgetown, Northwestern, and others. These are serious brands, as we would call them in the academic space. The terms of the agreements that were struck between Qatar and these universities were not always public. But it appears that there were significant financial perks to the US-based institutions for sort of selling their brand name to the Qataris. Of course, again, we don't know exactly what those terms are, but they have actually been fighting to not reveal them, including with Texas A&M. There has been a court case where they don't want to reveal the terms. But in the meantime, we have seen that Qatar-based scholars from these universities have weighed in on a wide range of issues impacting the debate of the war on terror, whether it's terrorism tactics, whether it's the way in which the Palestinian issue touches on this, Persian Gulf politics, terrorism finance. The Qataris they've been wielding quite a bit of influence over the years, buying lobbyists and conflicting out various law firms in this city, but also buying influence in other capitals around the world. So this is, I think, an area that we all should probably continue to watch. I don't know if there will be additional campuses added to Education City, but I think that certainly this could be a way for the Qataris, who are significant supporters of Islamist movements across the Arab world, from Libya to Syria and beyond, that they, and by the way, Hamas and even Al-Qaeda over the years, that this is something to watch moving forward. But all of this, I think, serves to underscore, as I wrap up, a rather depressing state of Middle Eastern studies. It's an enduring challenge, as Martin Kramer first laid out in 2001. His was really the first serious critique of the field. I'm a bit surprised, given the track record, that we haven't seen more follow-up, not necessarily from Martin, who I know has gone on to do other things, but there are still only very few, including ESMIA and Campus Watch and a few others, that continue to critique the field of Middle Eastern studies and try to mint new scholars that will be producing material that would be more relevant for policymakers in Washington. This, of course, should be the goal, but more importantly, the goal should be to teach students how to be independent thinkers and how to contribute to the greater good of American security and American foreign policy. So with help from organizations like ESMIA, hopefully we will see more opportunities for improvement. And again, I do think that it will be fascinating to see how China studies performs relative to Middle Eastern studies as this shift toward great power competition begins to take place. So I'll conclude there. I want to thank ESMIA, Asaf, and Suzanne for inviting me today, and I look forward to a broader discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate the comment, and obviously you touch on one of the greater ironies, as far as the terror funding of the academy, while the academy has, of course, denied terrorism, going back to our friends at Mesa, people like Joe Bainan, who back in after 9/11 mocked the study of terrorism, calling it terrorology and whatnot. So of course you see that the disconnect between the reality on the ground and between how it was perceived by academic practitioners who claim to know something about the topics. And again, part of the raison d'etre of ESMIA is to help create that balance, and of course help younger students get some kind of balanced understanding and footholding in the academy today. So let me start us off. I know Alex had a question to start us off with, then we'll go to the Q&A, and we'll take it from there. Alex, you ready to start?
Sure. Thanks very much for the presentation, John. I want to push back a little bit on one idea, and that is this notion that academia is somehow irrelevant to Washington and Washington's concerns. And I think that with respect to Middle East studies in particular, one could argue precisely the opposite, that academia is wholly and totally relevant, in the sense that the ideas of the last 20 years, really 30 or 40 years, or 50 years, as Martin points out in his book, have come to dominate government policy and a broad swath of the think tank world. And I'll cite two examples. And in fact, you cited one of them, the litany of books and articles and presentations, which are basically anti-Islamism, opposed to this idea that Islamism is a force, is a negative force, is a relevant force, and so on. And this dominates a broad area of discourse inside the government as well, in various elements of the State Department, the Defense Department, USAID, and so on. And also this idea that that various, as you sort of piquantly put it, gobbledygook notions about race, about gender, and so on, you know, have no contribution. They do. I looked it up while you were speaking. The U.S. U.S. gender programs in Afghanistan were budgeted at $787 million last year. So I would argue that, again, in a wholly negative sense, that academia has shaped American policy in an extraordinary way, much in the way that anti-communism and then anti-communism shaped American policy and academia in particular in the 1950s and 1960s. And this is another phase that we're going to be going into, as you say, as China becomes the predominant issue in Washington and globally. So I'll just throw that out as a comment and with a question mark appended
Sure.
to it.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, look, I think it's hard to disagree with the thrust of what you're saying, which is that you still do see the influence. I mean, without question, you've got kids coming out of undergraduate and joining the workforce, and the things that they learned undoubtedly have an influence on the way that they approach some of these issues. What I can say, though, is, you know, in the years that I worked at the Treasury Department tracking terrorism finance, it was I did not see a lot of influence. We didn't bring in academics to consult on the terror finance component of tracking al-Qaeda money. It just didn't happen. There are, of course, lots of debates on the Iran side of things, and I think that's an interesting one. As sanctions began to bite on Iran, beginning, I don't know, somewhere around 2000, let's say 2006, 2007, and as that campaign heated up, we began to see academics trying to weigh in about how sanctions would hurt rather than help, but it didn't actually influence the thinking of the US government, certainly not under the Bush administration, and even for the first half of the Obama years. It's unclear whether it was academic thought that convinced Obama that it was time to engage with the Iranians and fork over billions of dollars in sanctions relief. It seemed like it was more driven by just a lack of desire to engage in yet another war in the Middle East. And we're still seeing sort of the reverberations of that decision today as neo-isolationism, as I would call it, continues to dominate in Washington in both the Democratic and Republican parties. I would say that in the Pentagon, you don't often hear about academics coming in. You hear a lot about think tankers coming in to talk and to share ideas about how to solve various problems. I think the State Department is probably the area where maybe you'll see the most amount of academic influence. But I think, look, your broader point, I think, holds, which is that we see the ideas that are percolating in the academy. They've spilled over into a lot of the analysis that we see in the media. They dominate the woke culture that, you know, I think has really done a lot of damage, in my view, to independent thought. There does seem to be a herd mentality on a number of these issues. And I think it's for that reason that we see the continued failure of Middle Eastern studies along the lines of what Martin described. But I do take your broader point that it is, you know, it's trickling into a range of areas where decisions are made.
Martin has a question and he's online. Can we unmute Martin so he can ask John his question as well?
I hope it's not a question. I hope it's a long comment, because Martin, you are you're the pathfinder here.
Well, Jonathan, you know, it's grateful to have you remember a 20-year-old book. You've made an excellent presentation, and one which has the singular merit also of naming names, which is something I did in Ivory Towers too, and gives these discussions a particular resonance. Jonathan has, despite everything he said, an academic disposition in the best sense of the term, which is that, first of all, this passion for the objective pursuit of something called truth, and an ability to entertain, even if for a moment, a view not his own. And that's in pretty rare supply these days. But I call it an academic disposition just to remind us that, we are also academics. This is not an anti-academic enterprise. ASME is an association of scholars, and our objective isn't to sort of throw out academia altogether, but to bring about some kind of transformation in academia. And I think that's one of the achievements of the last 20 years, is the creation of alternative platforms such as this. So I find that actually very gratifying. I do have a question, actually, and it goes to this issue of prediction. I mean, one of the comebacks to my book from some of the denizens of Middle Eastern studies was, well, you accused us of failing to predict, for example, predict events like 9/11, but that isn't actually a good or even relevant measure of our expertise. Now, in the book, I didn't actually claim that they should have predicted 9/11, but when I thought about it, it occurred to me that the claim that prediction isn't a valid measure is not without some validity. I not long ago wrote an article about 7 black swans in the Middle East, where I put forth the proposition that really all the things that had major transformative effects in the Middle East since I started studying it were surprises. So a lot has happened that no one did predict. And so my question for you, Jonathan, is this: do you think that prediction is any measure of the validity of an approach to the region?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you asked this question, because look, there are things that we can't predict. I mean, as you call them, black swans. You can't predict black swans by definition are nearly impossible to predict, and it's very hard to say, well, there's going to be a financial crisis, or there's going to be a string of protests across the Arab world that are going to bring down autocratic governments that have been in place for 30 years. These are hard to imagine, but there are things that can rather easily be predicted when you kind of look at the logic of it. So just for example, this idea that Afghanistan would remain stable while the United States started to withdraw, right? We saw actually a lot of support from the academic world that this was the right thing to do. We needed to end the, quote, forever wars, which is a very odd term when you kind of look at history, which is a string of wars. But nevertheless, this was one of the academic arguments is, well, we need to do this, and this is the right thing to do. But nobody stopped to think what would happen when you pull out American troops, when you have a Taliban, and by the way, you do it, something as simple as you pull out your troops during the warmer seasons where fighting traditionally takes place. Had they left in the winter, when fighting season ends in Afghanistan, you might not have had the same outcome. And that's something where I think, the average academic should be able to say, well, wait a minute, this may not be a good idea. And so what I would just say is that, and some of the experiments that we've had in trying to promote democracy, for example, I think, Martin, you were probably with me in holding a rather dim view of the idea of holding elections in the Palestinian territories in 2006, when the Bush administration decided to do that. That, of course, led to the rise of Hamas. Logic told me as a student of that part of the world, this will not end well. We will see the rise of Hamas as a result, and it will grant legitimacy to a terrorist organization, and it's going to open up Pandora's box. So there are some predictions that I think you can make, and you can make on solid ground, and you don't need to be, you don't need to be smarter than everybody else. You're just deploying logic based on the knowledge that you've accrued over time, just having a good sense of what the region is all about. And I unfortunately, I think we don't see a whole lot of that coming out of Middle Eastern studies right now. I get more of a sense of a herd mentality. The idea that America is pretty much always wrong, that we need to, get out of the region no matter what, that we need to give a little bit more breathing room to Islamist movements. These are all things that, have backfired over time. And yes, and actually, I think to Alex's point, they have trickled into maybe even beltway thinking in the think tank space. And I think that that's also deeply problematic. But I do think that you can make predictions, and you should try to make predictions in this space. Not everything are you going to be able to predict. There are a lot of things that I missed, that we all missed. But there are a lot of things where I said, don't do this, did it anyway, huge mistake, predicted disaster, not hard.
Oh, good. Thank you both. Marin, any follow-up, or that was you're good?
No, I'm good with that. I wonder sometimes, you know, some of our heroes also have made wrong predictions over the time. I think, you know, it's very much a mixed record that we have, that all of us have. You know, if you're in finance, you're a hero if you're right 51% of the time. In political analysis, unfortunately, you become your reputation can go down the tube with one miss after a succession of accurate predictions. So so I'm a bit, you know, I've come as I've gotten older to question more and more our ability to take into account the complexities that go into human events. So and I totally expect to be surprised. So if there was one criticism of Ivory Towers, which I have taken in stride, it's a bit of humility in our ability to forecast, and even people who've gotten it right over the many years, including some of my mentors and heroes here and there, also stumbled, and we should just accept that as, you know, part of one of the risks of the profession. Just because someone has been wrong once or twice, there's no reason to discount them altogether either.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, Martin, you're probably thinking about Bernard Lewis, who I know was a mentor of yours. And I think, you know, he, in the later years of his life, was sort of, you know, had the albatross around his neck as being the guy that predicted that you could bring democracy to Iraq, and that he was derided for being one of the figures that I suppose was influential with the Bush administration thinking on that. And look, those are big things. And, you know, by the way, I mean, saying that that's possible or that it's preferable is not the same as coming up with a plan that can be executed by the Pentagon or by the State Department, where there are a lot of points of failure. You know, advocating for something that you'd like to see in the Middle East is not the same as predicting. And, you know, I think we should make that distinction. But, you know, the other thing that I would just say is, yes, we're all going to make mistakes, and we're all going to miss some big, I mean, I did not predict the Arab Spring. I don't know who did, by the way. I didn't predict 9/11, although I certainly saw the writing on the wall in terms of the rise of Islamist movements and violence against the United States. And there were not a lot of people, Martin, I think you were one of them, that did see that coming and could at least predict that something bigger was going to happen. But I think the key here is that, you know, there are a number of us who are willing to make those predictions and willing to go against the grain. And this is, I think, a key distinction right now when we look at the academic space. I see a lot of people pushing back against the US government. I see a lot of people challenging American policy. What I don't see is a lot of people pushing back against the herd mentality within academia itself. And that, I think, is interesting. You just don't see that sort of multiplicity of views that one would hope to see, whether, you know, it's pro-Israel voices in a sea of pro-Palestinian voices, or pro-democracy voices in a sea of pro-Islamist voices. These are things that I think have not, you know, when one takes a step back and you look at the entire landscape, I just don't see a welcoming of those disparate views. And I think that actually is probably one of the greater failures. It's not that people, you know, are taking risks and being held accountable. They're not taking risks. They're going with the herd, and the herd is missing these big picture issues, where if people were thinking for themselves, perhaps we would have maybe some alternative perspectives that don't come from the think tank space.
I think that's exactly right.
Great. Thank you both. With the time that we have, let's also go to the floor. Suzanne, why don't you take some of the questions from the chat and we'll take it from there.
Okay, so the first question we have here is from the Eller family, and they write, to your point that the academy became increasingly irrelevant for Washington policymakers, do you have any insights as to why the academy did not take steps to reverse this trend? Are they stupid or just blissfully arrogant?
I think it's blissfully arrogant, although I don't know how I would get myself into the heads of some of these folks. What I would say is that, academics generally talk to themselves, right? Anybody who's been to an academic conference, you just don't have a lot of outside thinkers. You don't have people challenging. So if the kind of herd is moving in a certain direction and everybody kind of nods in agreement, well, then everybody seems like they're happy that they've established a new paradigm for thinking about certain things. And, if there are no generals from the Pentagon there, or officials from the State Department taking copious notes and bringing them back so that decision makers can implement, that's just not something that I think, that's not a metric of success, at least as I understand it. The academic world is very insular. I think even more so in dealing with the tenured professors who, can't get fired for being wrong or can't get fired for not thinking outside of the box. I mean, they have the ultimate job security. And so I think there is a blissful arrogance, as I think the Eller family has put it.
Thank you. This question is from Carl Goldberg. It's a request, really. Kindly discuss the relationship between Islamism and Islam itself, based on the Quran, which is taught and preached in the mosques all over the world. Sure.
I mean, look, this is probably a full day seminar that we can get into, but it's an interpretation of Islam. It's a decision to embrace, to some degree or another, a more literal interpretation or a more extremist interpretation, the implementation of state policies as it relates to Islam. Of course, the Quran famously does not give a whole lot of guidance on governance, but there are rules, and those rules are interpreted by political movements and then applied. So you have the various Salafist movements and Takfiri movements that we've seen. You've got the Muslim Brotherhood. All of these are varying degrees of Islamism and the implementation thereof in terms of governance. And at the end of the day, are one of them more right or more in line with Islam as such? I don't know if I could say that one is or one is not. I think that the sort of admixture of politics in Islam it continues to be a challenge for the people of the Muslim world as they struggle with exactly how to have elements of Islam as part of their government. And it's certainly a struggle for American policymakers, maybe a little bit less so now as the United States has kind of given up on this idea of trying to influence the trajectory of Middle East states as they've been able to reinvent themselves. Certainly the Biden administration has given up on trying to influence whether the Taliban has an Islamist government or not. With the case of the Islamic State, because they were so murderous, there was no choice but to vanquish it. But we certainly tolerate a number of other Islamist movements around the Middle East. And again, that admixture of politics and religion, and that's just an interesting trend that we'll all have to continue to watch, especially as the United States exits this space. We've basically thrown our hands in the air and we've stopped talking about it.
Thank you. Okay, this is a question from Professor Jeffrey Herf, and he asks, as Islamism historic roots place it in the traditions of the extreme right, one would think that a liberal mood in the academy would sooner or later focus on this fact. Do you see any evidence of this taking place? Second, universities, unlike think tanks, can train a future generation of scholars. What is your overview of the training that is going on now in the field?
Yeah, Jeffrey, great to well, not see you, but see your name, and thanks for joining. Look, this is when we look at Islamism, it is the extreme right within the Islamic world, and it is anti-liberal. And the idea that this has not been picked up is really one of the more curious things. You know, it was one thing when the academy kind of ran headlong into an embrace with communists. You know, it was left with left. This is left with right. And it really never made sense to me how the illiberal values of Islamist movements could be embraced as they have been by the academy. And I think you point out, a really important point here, that all of the things that our academics advocate for on campus and the kind of woke culture that continues to emerge and really shape the roots of society, you don't see that at all within the Islamist movements in the Middle East. You don't see it because it is, you know, these are right-wing, ultra-conservative movements. And for whatever reason, this is not dawning on the academy in large part. And then in terms of universities training a next generation, training is certainly happening. I think it's producing fewer and fewer critical thinkers along the way. I can tell you that, you know, in a think tank like mine, we are certainly trying to develop additional, you know, kind of senior scholars. We've been successful in a few instances, but it's harder, right? I mean, the pool of people that we have that come in as research analysts right out of school, you know, we're talking about 4 or 5 people, and not all of them are going to be cut out for this world. So we've minted a few along the way, but the numbers game is so much higher in academia, and it does kind of make me shudder to think about what the future might look like in terms of the pool of applicants that will come to Washington and work for the State Department or even think tanks. It's getting harder and harder. By the way, I also just note that the level of writing has just become abysmal in terms of younger folks coming out of the academy. I don't know what they're teaching them there, but it's getting harder and harder to find people that can write on a professional level in their early 20s.
Okay, so well, this is a question and a comment. Harris writes, how can you claim Afghanistan will be a stable state with terrorist groups like Taliban? Relying on those elements is exactly the same logic that created Al-Qaeda, Taliban, released Shia mullahs in Iran in 1979.
Oh, I mean, it's a great point. I think it's obvious for anybody who's been a student of the region, watch how the Taliban is, how it did rule in the 1990s up until its ouster in 2002. And then it's even the building blocks of what they're putting in place right now for this new government, this Emirate of Afghanistan. There is, in fact, I can't really think of a country that exists where the government has embraced Islamist ideals and it has remained stable or has prospered. Iran is probably the best example of this, but it's driven its own economy into the ground. It has zero trust from the people. You look at perhaps the Omar al-Bashir regime in Sudan. That was another Islamist government that was run into the ground. There are other countries that have this sort of Muslim Brotherhood admixture of Islam and maybe more modern governance. A country like Qatar, but I don't think we could call that an emir or an emirate as we would in Afghanistan. So I have very little faith that Afghanistan will be stable, and the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration right now regarding the Taliban as partners or as more moderate relative to ISIS, it is really astounding. And again, one would expect to see academics come out and say, that's just wrong, that there is no way one can interpret this government in that way, or the rhetoric of this government, or the actions of this government in that way, and yet we're just not seeing the kind of voices that one would hope that would come out of the academy.
Great. Let me ask, with the time and keeping my mind of the clock, let me ask I guess will be the last question, John, if that's okay. So, I mean, obviously, all of us who've looked at the trajectory of the past 20 years and we've seen the ebb and flow of these issues, are you seeing, this going back to Martin's last point and what we're trying to do, obviously, at ASMEA, are you seeing some positive trends as far as, Washington today and, the growth of more content from the think tank world, from groups like ASMEA and other things that are looking around that is helping balance the environment and that we could kind of look, for an to end on a positive note and kind of see, some positive out there, and where we should be strengthening those issues. Obviously, you started to mention the issue of the terror finance and the money's coming in. Those are things that obviously many of us has looked at and tried to put pressure on universities not to take in terrorist money and to expose these things, transparency and accountability. Are you seeing more of that in areas that we should be focusing those anchors, so to speak, on creating and maintaining that healthy balance that the academy and the think tank world in Washington needs to get data and the right data?
Well, look, I think, absolutely full credit to ASMEA, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, and other organizations that have spent considerable time and effort trying to create a little bit more of a balanced playing field. And I think it's certainly helped the fact that scholars and academics have an opportunity to go to a different place, to voice different opinions, to be around other people who think differently. It's funny. It's in part a new platform, and in part maybe even a little bit of it feels like a self-help group almost, where you can escape from the herd mentality of groups like Mesa, for example, where you just don't have those voices speaking out and challenging the conventional wisdom. I noted this shift toward China studies, Asia studies. I actually think that this could be an important moment for Middle Eastern studies, and I'd be curious maybe to follow up with Martin on this at some point. But without the spotlight on the field, I also wonder whether this could actually prompt a moment of self-reflection. That without some of these professors being asked to make media appearances with their work in less demand as the United States pivots away from the Middle East and towards Asia, whether these academics will maybe have some time to reconsider some of these positions. It won't feel as urgent to deal with policies that they disagree with. I don't know. It could kind of provide a moment of pause, which can always help. But I think, look, the bottom line is that this is a field that continues to fail. The key here is to continue to have discussions along the lines of what we've had today, pointing out the glaring errors, looking at, I think Martin's point was the right one, is whether, we should be blaming people for taking risks and getting it wrong. I think if anything, we should be encouraging people to take additional risks, even if they get it wrong, so that we hear different things from this field. And this is, I think, what we're going to hopefully continue to push for. Certainly the think tank space offers that, and it is a great alternative, I think, to people who've maybe had a run in the academy and are willing to branch out and go elsewhere. There's also the hybrid model, where there are people who work for think tanks that also teach at universities. I actually find that model often works best, that people who've actually been involved in the application of policy in Washington are some of the best professors out there, especially if they know the history and they know the field. So there are some positive glimmers here, but the field itself is still in some trouble, and we'll have to wait and see what the coming decade brings.
Indeed, agreed all around. Hopefully we can encourage those movements, and obviously inquisitive research and some accountability and transparency of actually what's going on the ground versus what is perceived to be happening is actually, is a good thing. And obviously, we're here in our platform, in our small universe, to try to help make that happen as well. Really, I want to thank you, John, for taking the time this afternoon on such short notice. I appreciate the quick turnaround on your point and your insight and perspective as far as what the Beltway is seeing, and hopefully we can continue the conversation and take it from there. Also, I want to thank everybody, and of course, Martin, for joining us this afternoon and taking the time between the Jewish holidays and everything else to come together and talk about these critical and ongoing issues. So I want to wish everybody a good afternoon, a good day, and obviously those of you who are celebrating a good holiday all around. And we will talk soon. So thank you again, John, for your time and your insights.